Peace and love, everyone. Uh, my name is Andrew Hewson. I'm a spiritual teacher. I'm here with my friend, Davidya Buckland. David is the author of a blog and a book, Our Natural Potential. Both David and I have been around the process of spiritual awakening, witnessed cases of realization unfold through various physiologies, and including our own. And we come together to speak about the process of the awakening of conscious awareness. And this is the second talk of an ongoing series which we are engaging in. And in this talk, we're going to be covering we could say, secondary stages of development in conscious awareness, what David refers to as unity and refined unity, and what I refer to as source awareness and dynamic subjectivity. In our first discussion, we covered the initial shift into the recognition of reality in the status of infinity, that which is commonly referred to as awakening. And we discussed the various ways in which the awakening can unfold, ways in which it can be spoken about, and the variation that shows up in the field of this initial blossoming forth of the reality of consciousness within itself. And we also explored what that can look like in a refined context. So how the heart begins to blossom forth, or can even be present in the initial shift as a guiding or dominating influence. David, thank you for being with me again.
And thank you, Andrew.
I'm looking forward to exploring this together.
Yes, so if you're not familiar with the stages, it would be a good idea to take a look at our first conversation to put this into some context, although we'll talk about it a little bit. If you kind of think of consciousness as the underlying dynamics of all what we experience, there's a three-way process involved. There's the subject or observing aspect of consciousness, and the object or observed aspect, which is the world around us and all we're experiencing. And then there's the process of experiencing between them. In that first stage, we wake up to the observer value, sometimes called the witness. And there can be a sense of a detached observer observing an outside world. And that outside world may be perceived in a number of different ways. For example, as very solid and real, or as an illusion, or as a divine play, depending on the dominant guna. We talked about that more in our prior conversation. The key with unity is the object side, where it varies how that process unfolds, but in the classic description, there's basically that refinement of perception we talked about in God consciousness, and the awakening heart, and subtler and subtler perception of the mechanics of the world around us until we come to consciousness itself. And then at a certain point in there, we recognize that consciousness we're experiencing as creating the world around us is the same self as is observing all that field of experience. And so the subject and object are recognized to be one and come together into one wholeness. However, the mechanism there, varies quite a bit in how that's discovered. Sometimes it's just a matter of the depth of our awareness of consciousness gets deep enough that it's recognized to be underlying the field of the world. Sometimes people describe it like the world is like on a movie screen, and we become conscious of the screen itself as consciousness, and then recognize that we are that screen.
Beautiful. Yeah. So both David and I use the terms masculine and feminine to describe the primary aspects of conscious awareness. And in our last discussion, we discussed how those will show up in the initial shift. I have been bringing forward an understanding of a new style of shift, which is predominantly feminine. And in this case, it would be what was revealed or realized first. So rather than that being what makes unity or brings unity forward, it would already be present, and then the masculine side would click in, or the awareness, pure seeing side would click in after conscious awareness had already realized itself as the vibrant fullness that is the essence of form, and is appearing as the dynamism of the world. So these two aspects are extremely important to recognize, not something that is to be grasped and pinned down necessarily, but it's something that is immediately verifiable for anyone. There's this aspect of changelessness, and then there's the aspect that appears to be changeful. So the changeful aspect of our conscious awareness is punctuating the changeless aspect of our conscious awareness. And there's this this play that is the play of human life, that is the play of creation itself.
Right. And there can be this sense sometimes where we become, from the more masculine orientation, where we wake up to the silent consciousness first, and then become more and more aware of the liveliness in the environment around us, that lively consciousness that's there. And then with the unity shift, there can be the sense of like the liveliness swallowing up the silence. And because we're talking about oneness or unity here. It's not a two-ness anymore. They become one thing. Sometimes they talk about the gap between the absolute and relative fields of life, for example, and that gap disappears because there is no, they're one and the same thing. And it's important to understand here too, when we talk about unity or oneness in this context, we're not talking about interconnectedness or a sense of it. We're talking about experiencing it right on the level of our very being, right on the level of who we are. And once that shift takes place, then there's a progression in unity that's less obvious in prior stages. In prior stages, there is a deepening and integration that takes place, but in unity, it's sometimes described as unfolding in stages, because there's essentially an experience of become kind of a thing, where objects that were part of our regular experience or daily experience are progressively realized to be the self also. We experience the pot we're cooking with, or the pencil we're holding, or the sky, or the bird or the tree, or whatever like that. There's this progressive deepening. Sometimes they talk about it in levels of layers of experience. So the first layer of our experience, and then the background, and then the background to that, and progressively out. The Upanishads say even to include aspects of the universe that are beyond our perception. So it's like this progressive increasing, because consciousness is the container of all of it. It gradually grows into progressive stages. And one of the models of the stages is like on the level of the, similar to the koshas, but on the level of the elements, progressively through the elements. And then mind, intellect, and ego take on a cosmic value. And then we settle into a sense of a cosmic body as well, where we recognize that even this body, as an expression of consciousness, is actually universal and cosmic. It's the body of all bodies, and that is our form. It's not who we are on that level, because we're who we are in. Well, it is on the level of consciousness, but it's inclusive of, if I word that properly, it's not exactly an object in our experience because it's who we are, but it's not the thing that of who we are. It just is a part of that wholeness that consciousness contains.
Beautiful, yeah. So, if we go back to the masculine and feminine aspects of conscious awareness, when we speak about um, the body being recognized in its infinite value, we're typically referring to the feminine aspect. So,
Mm.
as I described the feminine style initial shift, that can also take place prior to the silent pure awareness being realized. And I know that David and I have kind of spoken about this. This wasn't something that he had seen, but in from my own direct unfoldment, and also in cases that I'm observing now, this is also beginning to take place, and then that changeless silent masculine aspect is coming online. So it's the same basic movement towards unity, but just what appears to be in a reversal of the typical model that
That's
David has put forth.
Yeah, and that's fascinating to me because that requires um, a level of refinement and an open heart to support that has not been typical in uh, in the West, particularly. But you know, I'm a more typical Westerner that way, and really strong mind, intellect oriented. So the masculine was much more obvious to unfold for me first. But then, if you have a full process, then the heart becomes a natural part of that.
Mhm.
Of unfolding. Otherwise, because it's the masculine and feminine together that is the fullness of it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, as we've discussed, you end up with a kind of a dry, um, flat experience of it. It can be very clearly awake, but still very dry.
Exactly, or there can be an absence of stability if the masculine is lacking as
Yes.
well. So it's this I work with this concept called the sacred marriage, which is basically the union in conscious awareness between uh, the distinction between the masculine and the feminine. And so I speak about this primary distinction, which can also be recognized as the pranava mantra. But basically, it's a primary vibration, the awareness becoming conscious of itself, self-conscious. And so that distinction then is sort of resolved through us, we could say, in a certain sense, because at first it appears to be very distinct, almost like a layering of ourself in terms of an infinite field. But then that layering sort of is resolved or dissipates so that it's sort of a seamless field of subjectivity. So
Yes.
we move from this layering of subjectivity where there's a very clear distinction in aspects, both infinite and not separate, non-dual, but still very distinct, into more of a seamless, fluid, flowing wholeness.
Yes.
And so that's what I would refer to as the sacred marriage. And I believe that that correlates with what you call unity, or probably refined unity.
Yeah. More into refined unity for that to
Mm.
be fully realized. Yeah. Um, another aspect of the unity process is because when we experience something, we recognize ourselves to be it.
Mhm.
There's a knowingness value that
Mm.
comes up with it, that the intelligence within the object, the nature of the object in its own nature, depending on our ability to perceive and recognize how clear we are on those finer levels. And again, that's a hard thing because the intuitive level where knowingness is most appreciated is a lot to do with the heart level,
Mm.
some to the third eye to some degree too, um, but it has a lot to do with the heart level, so it's important that be developed. And interestingly enough, that also correlates with the intellect.
Mm.
And one of the things that takes place is that with the intellect before awakening, it's primarily associated with the mind. So as the mind moves around here and there by different emotions and experiences that are arising and so on, the intellect gets pulled along with it, and it's not as stable or clear. And some people, like academics, learn to train their intellect more, um, but don't necessarily recognize their own biases. well, they tried to train that, but whereas after we've woken up, the intellect can shift from its association with the mind to the association with that inner being, that pure, the masculine side in this case, in this context, that stable inner silence, and that makes it much more stable and clear, and the term used is resolute, so we gain the resolute intellect. Then the heart has that key value, as we talked about earlier, and then as we're approaching unity, the intellect becomes a key, because it's the thing that discriminates and it recognizes that, oh, that's the same self. That stable, solid intellect is, that is myself, and that is myself, and that not in an overt kind of way, but in a very subtle discrimination, this subtle discrimination that goes on, and that ties again into the knowingness, that progressive process. Another aspect that's worth touching on too, that varies a lot in people's processes, but there's this progressive release of these core identifications. There's a core mind identification that is released, the sense of me, mine, with the initial awakening. Then there's a resolution of the emotional contraction to open the heart, and then finally there's a gut contraction that's associated with unity stage. Now I've seen, and there can be, because that's the gut is a fire center, there can be a sense of roasting or burning, barbecue of the what I refer to as the core identity, and it has kind of association with our childhood identity, or perhaps with our sense of our given name. And one of the, and so that can happen with the unity shift slightly before it, or in some cases much later. And I've seen cases where it's kind of clear that that hasn't happened yet, even though they've moved into still higher stages. So in an ideal way, any kind of core sense of identity is resolved with the unity shift to support that. One of the things too that can happen with the unity shift itself is there's a for some people there's a key, like a single recognition. The intellect recognizes the self, and there's a shift right away, very clear, distinct shift. For some people, for others, like myself, there was several steps in the approach over about a 10-day period, in my case, where there was that sense of roasting the core identity, and in some ways I might not have recognized it, except that I had seen some material, the conversation between Locke Kelly and Adyashanti on the topic, and so when it happened, I had some context. It was fairly short. And then I noticed there was no longer a distinction between inside and outside, that there was a kind of a continuum, that there used to be kind of a bit of a, this was inside my body, and that content is outside my body. But there was no longer a barrier. It was just, it was just all consciousness, essentially.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
That's a great point, how the resolution of those core layers of identification also correlates with the infinite value of the body being recognized, or sort of a seamlessness in terms of body and environment. So in the cases where perhaps there have been higher stages that have unfolded without those levels of clearing, I would say that perhaps that also is going to correlate with what appears to be an absence of the recognition of the cosmic value of the body, or the infinite value of the body. And the depth that can really shine forth in. And then, of course, we also can have this very, very distinct sense of recognizing the projected environment to be our body as well, or to be inside of our body while it appears outside of our body. So there's all this variation that can shine forth in refined unity, or what I call dynamic subjectivity. And a lot of it ties back to this kind of basic fundamental healing process, or transmutative process where certain layers of unresolved material are being released and resolved.
Yeah, and at first I kind of thought that, oh, I just had a really short, brief release of that core identity, but over time I realized that there was lots of other stuff around that had to be resolved, but it didn't take place in a short period of time. It took place over an extended period of time. It's kind of, it was similar to my experience of the first shift, actually, where the core falls out with the shift, with that roasting, and then but there was a lot of other accessory attachments that would gradually surfaced and were cleared over time, or have been cleared over time. We'll see how complete that is. Because I find it fascinating, because I have because of that refinement, I'm able to actually look inside my body and see where there's contractions and look, and I was actually looking and not seeing anything, and so I thought that process was done, and then it turned out there was some little stuff tucked away in shadows. This stuff has a remarkable ability to hide itself from itself.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I'm sure you would concur with me in saying that as things continue to really refine and shine forth in terms of divinity. So as the pure divinity of reality just begins to really reveal itself to itself within its own mind, the apparent increase of the brightness of that light correlates with these pockets of unseen, unresolved material just continually beginning to be brought up into that light.
Yes.
So it's really, some may think just on a basic sort of assumption that, oh yeah, well, when you move into higher stages, there's going to be less there. That's why you moved into higher stages. And that is true in a certain context, but it's also very helpful to recognize that oftentimes a lot of the darker material, denser material, can't really be processed out until higher stages. You don't have enough, there's not enough stability, there's not enough, the physiology is not refined enough.
Yeah, just to be able to see it, and because it resides on a finer level, and also the ability to support the process, to be able to handle what's in there sometimes, because sometimes it's can be pretty traumatic old stuff, because we're talking about long histories long before this life that we can bring forward and carry forward into this one. Yeah, and so here there was that process of that initial release, and then that the dissolving of the sense of inside and outside, and then I went on a retreat. And for me, the interesting experience was there was a collapse of history, I guess you could say. So all these sort of inner layers that had unfolded to my experience, the koshas that I talk about, the sheaths or inner layers of how consciousness becomes the world, kind of thing, all those layers of that process, they all disappeared, which I found quite odd. And I recall I was sharing a room on the retreat, and it was bedtime and lights out, and there's a bit of light leaking in the window, so I could still perceive. So I knew that that the world hadn't disappeared, but all inner references to that had vanished. And then it basically all came back again, but now in this new context. So the whole this whole history had to be released and let go of, so that the shift could take place, the final shift, and then it could be brought back in that new context over a period of time.
That's a really beautiful point, that there's sort of, we're stepping into this new contextual modality, as I call it, this new context of seeing ourself, or the self is stepping into itself through this unique expression of its own intelligence. And then after there's this familiarity with that, we come to a new sort of threshold point where we're called to let that go, so that an even broader or more inclusive or more expansive recognition can shine forth, which then ends up including what we appear to let go of, or surrender.
Yeah.
But it just is something to have an awareness of in terms of attachment to, different recognitions or realizations that unfold, because uh, you know true spiritual maturity is the willingness to give everything up, continuously to give up what it is that we have realized. And sometimes it can be quite majestic.
Yes.
It becomes sort of normalized after a certain point, I would say, but initially, at least, it's like this, the splendor of all of creation is, dazzling forth, and you see all the mechanics and everything, and it's all. And if you're cognizing, that's even a whole nother ball game, because you
Yeah.
have, everything there at once, and you can just kind of flip through it like a book. And but it's the willingness to give that up,
Yeah.
and that's where the grace of that light that I was talking about before, that pure divinity, begins to really shimmer in. Mm,
Yeah. I remember around that time, my teacher made reference to perpetual surrender.
mm.
And I was kind of horrified because at that point there's been a series of surrenders, but they were brief and they were short-lived. The idea of being able to perpetually surrender, whoa, that was a whole other level. Yeah, it yeah, it's a remarkable unfolding. One of the things I mentioned earlier too was that there can be that experience that in self-realization and that initial awakening that the world is illusory,
Mm,
the Rajas guna is dominant. And if we invest in that as the reality, as opposed to a stage in the process, a
mhm,
stage in the refinement process, then it can actually be a barrier to unity.
mm.
Because in order for us to discover that the world is myself also, we can't be seeing it as an illusion.
Sure.
Yeah, we have to move past that. And if we're invested in that as a concept, that's the reality, that actually can be a barrier to going further.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
that's beautiful. It's a valid stage. So, many are going to taste that sense of where everything's just an appearance and awareness. And, they are awareness. And so, and everything else is just an appearance in awareness. But what you're pointing to, David, is that, having the understanding that that is not, that's just something that's a subjective recognition at that point.
yes,
And that the possibility is that what seems to be sort of this dreamlike appearance in awareness actually can be recognized as that, as the dynamic intelligence of your own self throbbing within itself. And that's the pulsation that I was referring to. That's the primary distinction in between the masculine and the feminine in conscious awareness.
yeah. Another thing I found really fascinating about the process, referring back though for a moment to a comment, because one of the things I found about unity too is because there was that progressive, the Brahma Sutra calls it the aggregate. We're
Mm,
continuing expanding what is the self, and so it kind of keeps growing and growing and growing, far beyond any sense of what we might think would be included in it. Um, so there's a sense of what's new today. It's
mhm,
sort of like, because it's there's the shift, and then there's the processing of the shift,
mm,
and where we integrate it and so on. And so there can be an almost constant um, sense of reality shifting. So we get
mhm.
very used to that.
Yeah.
Whereas before we're kind of like holding on, and this is my reality, we get really, really used to letting it go and seeing where it goes today, kind of a thing. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, that's another thing that I've explored actually before in terms of masculine and feminine is the feminine as flexibility and the masculine as stability. So
mm,
the stability, if it's taken to the extreme, becomes rigid and can be a limitation if it's not balanced out by the flexibility of the feminine. And then again, if the flexibility of the feminine is taken to the extreme, it becomes loose and wobbly and all over the place.
yeah,
So it's the complementary reunion of the flexible and the stable that reveals itself as this fullness of self-realization, which we're referring to in terms like unity, refined unity, or dynamic subjectivity. Yeah.
yes. And really, it's when the whole business of non-duality begins to unfold in earnest.
Mm.
Because prior, in self-realization, there can be a sense of an inner non-dual state, but
Mhm.
the world is separate. And we can
Mm.
say, oh, the world is illusory, we can dismiss that. But that's not actually true non-duality, because there's still something that's separate. And that progresses forward past unity as well.
Yeah, that's a great point too, because when I've talked about the feminine style initial shift, one of the things that can show up there that is this sort of there can be this kind of sometimes a very it's more of a progressive style of shift, whereas with the masculine style shift, it tends to be a little bit more clicky.
Yeah, yeah,
Very much like
yeah,
a
yeah,
razor, a
yeah,
razor
yeah,
of awareness. So with the feminine style shift in the initial stage, at least, which we spoke about in our last talk, it really sometimes can be lacking in a certain degree of certainty. I've seen in some cases, and this sort of yeah, it doesn't have that severed edge to it until the masculine side of things comes online,
yeah.
which provides a great deal of stability. Mm.
Yeah, it's interesting too. That was another thing I remember noticing at a certain point in there where um, I mean, it keeps evolving. But one of the things I noticed in the initial stage before the refined stage developed was that um, the world had been very real before,
Mhm.
and then it had become less. There was a less sense of there was less sense of reality from the outside world of experience, and then there had become this sense of the world being a divine play. But when the world was recognized to be absolute consciousness also, it took on this concreteness again that it
Mm.
hadn't had, and actually it was greater. It had a greater sense of reality to it. The world
Mm.
appearance had a greater sense of reality to it than it ever had before,
Wow.
and a kind of a solidity, a concreteness, which I found fascinating because I thought that was long
Yeah, that
gone.
is interesting. So
Yeah.
in terms of that solidity, though, it had a different qualitative,
Yes.
presentation. So it's not the limited physical type of solidity that before seemed to prevail.
Right. It's an
But in
absoluteness.
you,
Yeah.
it's an infinite solidity. It's a solidity which is of the nature of the self itself. Yeah.
Yes, and not
And this
everybody has that from what I've seen, but it is it's not uncommon for that step.
Yeah, now that you mention that, I do recall that sort of sense. Yes, that the value of seeing everything in terms of self sort of provides this new recognition of its reality in a way that could be described as concrete
Yeah.
or
And it's not that the appearance is what's real. It's
yes.
it's that what's behind the appearance, what's creating the appearance is the reality behind that.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really fascinating process. I mean, I really enjoyed the Unity stage a lot
Mm.
because it was I learned a lot from it, and a lot of there was a whole progression that unfolded. Um,
Yeah, it is sort of an enchanting stage, isn't it? I remember, I think I always qualified it in the self refamiliarizing itself with its own dynamic intelligence, and
yes,
I think that that's kind of what it was really about here and in other cases as well. It's this adventure of the self exploring its own intelligence, and sort of remembering, oh wow, this is how I'm appearing as this tree, and this is how this is, I'm flowing here, and all of these, and a walk through the woods is really a miraculous affair.
yes.
Mm.
Yeah, there's this constant self-discovery in this whole
Yes.
other level because it's all self. So
Yeah.
it's just, and you can't, and there's only a certain amount you can do that because it has to all be, recognized and processed and stuff. But
Yeah.
there's a kind of a process of, oh yes, I'm that too, and I'm that too, and then sometimes you can pause a little bit on it, and like you mentioned, what is it to be a tree, and what is it to be a cat or whatever,
Of course.
or
Yeah.
the grass or whatever like that, and
Mm.
go into it. Although I did have to recognize at a certain point in there that even when I was experiencing what it was to be a tree, I was experiencing it from that perspective of unity consciousness, not from the perspective of the tree's consciousness.
Yes, yeah. One of the ways that became is clear is in terms of like a human conversation, because it's obvious that you're conversing with yourself, that
Yes.
and you can feel that you're in the other viewpoint, but obviously their subjective experience is much different than what it is that you're tasting. So even though there's that absolute seamless unity and flowing subjectivity, and you see yourself as the speakingness arising from the other person, it's still not that you're not tasting exactly what it's like at that level of consciousness. That level of experiencing is a different level.
Yeah.
And
because they're in there identified with various things that you may not be, and you
correct.
be identified with other things, and the laws of nature are a little bit different. But you
Yeah.
do get a sense of the laws of nature that
Hmm.
are functioning there. It's pretty fascinating. Of course, there's also respect for people's privacy and so on like that. There
Sure.
are appropriate boundaries in there. Um, but it is, the sort of the idea that there's something secret or there's anything that can't be known is a bit.
All right. So I'll just say something about that privacy as well, because it's really what, I would say that it's not really a volitional decisioning, it's more like a spontaneous recognition. It's the self that is flowing like that and seeing itself like that. So
Right.
it's not like there's a me here invading, someone's privacy.
Yes,
Like,
yes, that's a good point.
that's like that would be something that was going on like prior initial shift with some type of refined perception. I don't know a lot about that kind of stuff, but from the value of infinity, it's not like that. It's very simple and pure and innocent and not
Yes.
yeah.
I mean, I did at a certain point, especially in refined unity stage, spend a little bit of time, what is it to be a tree, and spending,
Yeah.
taking the focus into a tree and in consciousness, just to be clear that we're talking about in consciousness,
Yes.
and experiencing that aspect of it. But I found with people, I didn't find it pleasant, particularly. Because then you were stepping into their karma and their contractions and stuff like that. So it was like, okay, I've dealt with that stuff on myself. That's enough.
Okay, yeah,
I'll
all
just,
right, great. You make
yeah,
a great point, and so maybe
yeah,
that's why I need to clarify. I'm talking more in terms of the experiencing, so it's more like pure experiencing.
yes,
So instead of really going into the body, in that way, it's the dynamism that's bubbling as the experiencing,
yes,
uh,
yes,
and self in terms of the pure experiencing of what appears as the other and what
yes,
is of that
yes.
which is
We're talking about in
appearing.
consciousness, not. It's not like we're astral traveling and
No,
going
no,
into
no, no,
their
no.
body.
We're already everywhere, right?
Yeah,
There's
yeah,
there's nowhere to travel because
exactly.
we've got
Yeah.
all the bases covered on that on
Just
that.
kind of moving the focus of attention around a little bit. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and it's also that also points to another key detail about unity that's quite it's worth noting, and that is of intimacy.
Hmm.
Because when we are it, it's intimate. It's who we are. So everything is a part of myself. So there's a profound intimacy in the experience of what we might feel as intimate within ourselves, our thoughts and our emotions, is now the world is part of that as well.
Hmm.
And in a sense, the cosmic thoughts and the cosmic emotions are part of the collective consciousness around us, which
Hmm.
we're also aware of and involved in. We've been sharing notes a little bit about the dynamics in the collective around the American election, for
Yeah.
example, that's going on. And it's like this uh,
Roller coaster. Yeah.
yes, it's going on in the collective. So it's part of the environment, and it's part of, or we process some of that
Mhm.
as it comes up in the experience. But there's kind of like a balance point you have to manage, because you gotta be functional and
Hmm.
not trying to take stuff on, but just process what's arising and naturally, and so we assist, but in what ways we're good at, but um, yeah, not getting caught up in the drama.
Yeah. Beautiful point. Beautiful point.
Yeah, there's another key idea they talk about in the Vedic tradition called Laisha Vidya, which basically means remains of ignorance, and it has several contexts. But as we become everything, sort of all the various aspects of ignorance fall away. But we still require some areas of ourselves to be human, to function in the world. If we were just became completely absolute, we drop the body and go. The key here is living these stages in a human life.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's some value of a person needed to be in the world and to recognize that this is the edge of my body, and this is the here's the keyboard I can touch or whatever like that. That's not the body. Some of those little values of surface individuality are still required to function, and so they call that the remains of ignorance. And in a kind of a way that resolves more and more and more over time, partly as these old things we were talking about earlier come to the surface to be seen and processed, old karmas and old incomplete experiences and so forth, that arise in our experience and are processed. Each of those basically releases a bit more energy, a bit more shadow is cleared, a bit more clarity, a little less ignorance, all through this process. But there's always going to be some value of it to live in a human form. That's kind of I heard somebody mention something just a few days ago that it was you get to be about 75% absolute and 25% relative, but I don't know. That's just a number. I'm sure it varies extremely widely.
Sure. Yeah, and I think we're still, in terms of the exploration of that collectively and how that's going to show up in the West, and how higher stages like post consciousness stages are going to reflect more clearly in physiologies. I mean, a lot of that's still unseen. We're in the midst of the flowering of that, so we don't want to create any limitations around it. Because I think that certainly the possibility is for there to be very, 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 very clear, refined reflections of divinity walking around, and that's what we want collectively. We don't want to say, oh no, you can't. You always have to have, you always have to be really.
That's pretty amazing, actually. There are so many people now who are living some value of pure divinity. It's pretty astonishing. I don't think it was very common for a long. I mean, certainly wasn't common, but I think it was very, very rare for a long time.
Yeah, scripturally, you can't. There's not a lot available that points to that value. I don't think. I'm sure. I mean, it's there, but it's sort of hidden, and there's a lot of words that are kind of mixed up and things like that, which we'll talk about when we get to Brahman. That one's a big one, but one thing I was going to say, I can't remember, about cosmic personality, and just going back to sort of the body and everything like that. So this value of Lesha Vidya, which is just the remains of the personality structure, the intelligence, the laws of nature operative in the world, sort of on a daily level, is extremely important. And I think that one of the things that you and I both talk about a lot is kind of, being in higher stages in daily life, at the grocery store, at the dentist's office or whatever, and just, living life, and being that, not being conflictual with being in what previously would have been deemed to be exalted, stages of awareness. And I think that they are on some level.
Yeah, it's a good point, because the unity isn't a goal. It's a way of living, a perspective of life that allows a much fuller value of life to be lived. The whole point of it is to live it.
Yeah, and I mean, you do end up in the doctor's office where everything's just a flowing mass of subjectivity, and you see yourself as the dynamism of everybody walking around, and all of that. But it's not. It becomes something that's so it's so at home and so familiar and so immediate, and that nobody really knows that that's going on. Nobody else knows that it's going on.
Yeah. Although it can trigger other people. I'm not very often, but occasionally I find somebody starts to purify, and
Mhm.
they sometimes they seem to associate it with you, but they don't know why or whatever. But they just get grumpy with you in some way, and it's like okay,
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, you could do a whole study on how, someone in awakened consciousness or in higher stages, how that sort of correlates with the environmental context of different points and things like that. Because I've also seen it in the direction of there being sort of this joyful wanting to sort of serve, like
yeah,
spontaneously, like, oh, let me open the door for you, like, 'cause the
right,
soul senses something, and those kinds of things. But it can go either way. It's
yeah,
a great point.
good point. Yes,
Yeah.
and I just find the one I mentioned is more a little more obvious in some ways because
Right. Yeah, that's right.
like something
Yeah.
you have to deal with. The other part of it, of course, is integrating what we're talking about.
Mm.
It becomes quite normal. I mean, it sounds kind of crazy sometimes, but what we're saying, but it actually becomes very normal. But
Mhm.
you also have to learn how to talk to people who are experiencing life in a traditional way, um,
Yeah.
in the common way. Because if they ask you how you're doing, we can't go into this kind of subtopic without a lot of
Right.
backstory. It's like, oh
Sure.
yeah, this thing just happened, and wow, isn't this amazing? And yeah, it,
Yeah.
that's kind of more normal.
Yeah, and I mean, that's an adjustment, I think, with every shift, in terms of conversation, at least, because, someone can ask you, hey, how are you doing this morning? And that question doesn't really make any sense, especially if it's sort of fresh, like, it's like, oh, yeah, yeah, I'm doing great. Takes a while to come around.
Yeah,
Um, but that's one of the values of being in the midst of life, being in the midst of the world, is that we're kind of constantly brought into the dynamism of experience
and integrating. Yeah,
and integrating. And so that's sometimes I feel like what is presented as an integrated shift is sort of like where someone goes up into, recognizing their reality, and then they sort of leave it behind and they return to a space that they were before, and that's not integration.
right.
Integration means that you don't come down off you don't come down from where you were. The experiencing rises to that and is a
Yeah,
seamless wholeness with that.
and then it integrates back into the physiology as
It's
well.
into
So
the
it's like,
physiology, but you
yeah,
don't leave behind the reality of the field
yeah,
because
it
that's
stays
what
with
you
you.
are. Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes it can be more background or more foreground
Yeah.
or like that. I mean, there's a normalcy to it where when it becomes more, it's just kind of there. And anytime
Sure.
it's like, oh, is it there? And oh yeah, it's there. And
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
you're doing what
That's a
you're doing.
great point as well. Yes. So
Yeah.
there's going to be like degrees of, varying degrees of clarity, and I think that correlates as well with the process of surfacing and healing and transmutation.
And I've also been really pleased with how well, I mean, in retrospect, I didn't see it so much at the time, but in retrospect, I can look back and see how well my life supported this process.
Mm,
Things that weren't going to support the process fell away, and circumstances came up that supported the arising to take place when it was time. So we can get frustrated with, our seeming lack of progress and that so sometimes, but when the time comes, when grace is going to descend, grace also organizes the circumstances for it. And it can
yeah.
seem like things are kind of falling apart, and sometimes, or we're getting this amazing support either way
Mhm.
again, or both. Um, but it's kind of just the way that nature kind of organizes stuff. And I mean, for myself, I found a much deeper trust in nature and in the world that was going to support me, in not necessarily how I wanted it to come or how I expected it to come, but in ways that were, quite remarkable in another way.
Yeah, that's a great point that kind of ties into this stage as well. Because that value of self is sort of supremely realized in both the masculine and feminine aspects, and there's a real deep union of that, a resolution of the sort of prominence of the distinction. What what can begin to take place is this degree of knowingness that's arising from that oneness, that sense of oneness. So you talked about knowingness before, and I guess I'm linking it now to the word trust. So there's this sort of sense of knowing where to go, what to do, what step to take, um, so on and so forth. It could be seen as like a sort of semi-omniscience, or a sense of sort of really feeling attuned to the intelligence of life. And
And and you get signals sometimes where it says, oh, you need to go there now, or you
yep,
need to do this now. And it's like, what? That doesn't make any sense. But
exactly.
when you learn to trust that and you do it, and then it's like, that's kind of part of why I got my grad degree. Just,
Hmm.
it was like, go there. And it was like, no, that doesn't make any sense. And it's like, and then I got another reminder and another reminder. And it's like, okay, okay, okay. And I, left the life I was trying to make, and went off to the States and ended up in a grad degree program. And it just kind of all fell in my lap. And
Yeah.
it all went click, click, click. And the admissions office said it would take a miracle for it all to come together in time, but it all just went click, click, click. And I was very late applying, but
Yeah,
yeah, it
that's
was
really
fun.
beautiful.
Yeah. So
Yeah, it's like you're sometimes I reflect on in that space where seeing someone speaking is seeing yourself speaking, and you can actually, the words can really very much seem custom fit, like coming out of someone else's mouth, that you're speaking to yourself, you're telling
yeah,
yourself to go here, to do this, to
yeah.
whatever.
Oh,
You're reminding yourself.
I've even had literally people stop on the sidewalk and say, I don't know why I'm telling you this, but I feel like I'm supposed to tell you this.
Yeah, I've also had similar
Yeah, it's like, and they're really mystified, and I'm kind of like, oh, okay.
all right, yeah, that makes
I,
sense, yeah.
I got used to it. Yeah, and that kind of leads us into what I call refined unity.
Mhm,
Um, and essentially, if there's been that God consciousness process, the refinement and the opening heart, and that going on the feminine side uh, previously, then that essentially continues into unity. But there can be a kind of a break in there, like I mentioned, all the previous stuff falling away, and then the shift happening, and then the shift becoming established and kind of growing a little bit, and then gradually the refined aspects that had been there before were reintegrated, and then that continued. Um, some people may not have much of the feminine early on, and they can have the unity shift, a little bit drier perhaps, um, and then the refinement starts to unfold after unity,
mm,
or even after Brahman. It kind of depends on when that kicks in, or it can just be a really very slow process. Whereas, as you mentioned earlier, whereas the stages in consciousness are distinct
mhm,
shifts, where the climax, the the um, the shift is at the start of the process,
mhm,
whereas the feminine is more climactic shifts, where we build up to a flowering at the climax.
yeah,
Um, and so essentially that refinement kicks in. You refer to it as dynamic subjectivity,
mhm,
um, because the subject is alive,
yeah,
moving. It's not silent anymore the same way.
mm,
And what highlights, I talked about at the beginning about the subject and object, with the process of experience between them, the subject and object become one. And so what dominates the refined unity process is the Davidya value, that process of experience in the middle,
mm,
the liveliness. And so there was that concreteness before that I talked about, but now everything becomes flow. So even though we're looking at solid objects, there's a recognition that they're constantly being recreated in every moment.
mhm,
And there's a flow. Everything's full of moving consciousness, basically,
yeah,
flowing and moving and vibrating. And the vibration has sounds, and depending on which senses we're more attuned to and so on, like that, there may be visual stuff, it may be more feeling values, it may be more um, sound values. We hear things, or we feel vibrations, or we see vibrations, or like waves or whatever. um, and there's this whole the world becomes kind of alive, um, and sort of like rich with life in a new kind of way. Now in the God consciousness stage, we can recognize that the world is full of life, forms of various styles, depending on how that our unfolding is going on. And so all these different levels of, we've got the physical world and the sort of the emotional energy layer and the mental layer and so on. And all these layers can have different kinds of life forms, you could say, that on them. Each becomes progressively more abstract and comes down to basically they're just essentially a point of light. They don't have a physical form even. But there is that value of the laws of nature, of the Davidya value, the core qualities or principles that are functioning become much more prominent. And it's one of the reasons, actually, I was reflecting recently that karma is unfathomable, not just because it's so complex and the field of creation is so vast, but also because the doers, the actual intelligence that's behind all the doing and the support and the experiences we're having and everything, they're in that value, and it's the most subtle dynamic in consciousness, and so we kind of come to it the last, and that's when things can make a lot more sense, and when we actually understand the mechanism itself. I mean, we can see parts of it before that, but to see the actual intelligence and the way that it plays out is really brings a much greater fullness to that.
Beautiful. Yeah. So I'm just going to do a quick recap for those that are listening, so that we can kind of bring together both of our models. In unity, I refer to something called source awareness. So this is where the masculine, pure, changeless awareness, the feminine, dynamic, conscious presence have both been recognized, but also a little bit different from the way that you point to it. I typically see that some degree of beyondness has also been recognized. So some degree of beyond awareness has been recognized, but it's not dominant. So the self is still dominant, even though there's a degree of the recognition of that out of which the self is arising or shining.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So this is and here, this is where the distinction is very prominent in terms of masculine, feminine, and then beyond. So there's like a layering, almost like a, there's that, then there's the isness of awareness, and then there's the presence of conscious presence. Yeah, the feminine aspect. So that's source awareness, and then in terms of refined unity, I'm looking more like dynamic subjectivity. This is what I would compare it to. And that's where that sacred marriage takes place that I was referring to earlier. So the distinction between the masculine, changeless, silent awareness and the feminine, conscious presence is resolved or collapses into this seamless unity, seamless wholeness, where, as you have just been describing, the flow of the self experiencing itself comes into the foreground. So there's a prominence of that flow. There's a prominence of the aliveness and the dynamism of the self within itself, and seeing oneself as the dynamism. So the self is actually seeing itself as the dynamism.
Yes.
In a new and fresh way.
Yes. The consciousness is, it started off with consciousness being this silent, still, absolute, and then it's like just flow and movement and aliveness. Yeah, it's a whole different thing, and it's all lit up. It's not a dark silence.
No, not at all. And this becomes relevant later in pure divinity as well. So we sort of that's recontextualized. And if there was a degree of beyondness present in source awareness, which typically there will be in what I've seen, that is going to sort of fall deeply into the background in dynamic subjectivity. If dynamic subjectivity comes after source awareness, it can go either way. Dynamic subjectivity can come first, or source awareness can come first. So it just depends.
Oh, that's interesting. Because most of the people that I've talked to were oblivious to actual Brahman, that beyondness, because consciousness was such a dominant part of their reality.
Wow.
And it didn't seem to me possible that people would become truly aware of the beyondness prior to essentially consciousness becoming aware of its totality. And when
Yeah,
it
that's a
becomes aware
great
of its totality, then it's
point.
able to take this step back and get a sense of beyondness, because it's always been looking in on itself, and then it can take a step back and see more. I mean, there's
Yeah.
nothing that would restrict us to that, but I hadn't seen examples of that, so that's really
Yes, yes. So I have seen examples of that, and that's the way that it unfolded here as well. And I've also seen other examples, and in that it's different from the actual, like, the void or Brahman, in the sense that the self is still dominant,
yeah,
and it's more that it's like the self looking back through its own light and recognizing the thatness, the beyondness,
yes.
but
Was
the
my sense at
thatness.
first. There was kind of like a stepping out of consciousness and seeing it from the outside, and
Mhm,
then there was the turning and recognizing Brahman. But it was
sure.
still it was still dominant in the awareness. That's
Yeah.
really interesting, though, that the possibility that they could come in either sequence, and that would make
Mhm.
some sense if the refinement and the feminine is the dominant process.
Yes.
Um, then then the refinement would be more dominant even after a unity shift, and
Mhm.
then the union would become more obvious. Like it would because that would the refinement part could overshadow to some degree the actual unification process.
Mhm. Yeah.
And then the unification process takes place as an unfold. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and then also that kind of becomes relevant too in terms of there's a similar process with recognizing that dark beyondness in pure divinity, which you wrote about recently in an article you titled Krishna Consciousness. So
Yes.
it sort of ties back into what I'm saying in reference to source awareness, but in a totally new context from pure divinity.
Yes.
Um,
Okay.
yeah, so there's a little bit more of an equilibrium between the self and the source in source awareness, and then in what you qualify as Brahman or describe as Brahman, and what I call the void, that the self appears to disappear or sort of
Yeah.
become.
Yeah. And that's interesting too, because what I did for me when the Krishna value unfolded,
Hmm.
I went back and recognized previous things as that.
Hmm. Yeah.
It was like, oh, that's what that was,
Mm.
because Krishna means black in Sanskrit,
Yes. Yeah.
and so there's this kind of areas that are still black that aren't lit up, and
Hmm.
then realizing that it wasn't just nothing; it's actually fully alive.
Yeah.
So that was the revelation here. Another detail, again referencing the uh, consciousness dynamics. There's the observer, the observed, and the process. In Sanskrit, they have the name Rishi, Devata, and Chandas. Chandas
Mm.
is the observed, the world itself. And it has a value of covering. That's kind of what it means.
Mm.
Um, the word means. And so at first, like there's that sense of the world being real, and there's the sense of the world being illusory. But it's like being in a movie theater. Are we absorbed in the movie and think it's real? Or are we aware that there's a movie playing on and we're enjoying the movie, but we recognize that it's a movie?
Mm.
Um, or are we think, oh, this is the divine stage play being prepared right now for us live, and
Yeah.
there's kind of these layers of that experience. But with the chandas values, what happens with the refinement is that the movie itself becomes more transparent, so to speak.
Mhm. Mm.
We start to recognize the screen on which the movie is playing.
Yeah.
And so, and then recognizing that's consciousness, and as part of that process we talked about earlier with consciousness unifying, the object value being recognized as consciousness. But there's a further value that takes place in refined unity, where there's further refinement, where the screen itself starts to become transparent.
Mm.
Oh, that's when then there's that value of seeing beyond the screen, which is what you were just referring to a short time ago, seeing the beyondness that's behind that. That
Yes.
tends not to unfold, the way my process has gone. People with my kind of path, but it tends not to unfold until shortly before Brahman. But essentially, there's just this gradual, everything becomes more and more transparent.
Mm.
So even solid objects are just flows of consciousness,
Yeah.
and then it's what's actually consciousness, and so on, like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's beautiful. So it is possible though that the beyondness can actually be recognized first, but there's still this there's a still a very defined sense of a primary distinction between the masculine and the feminine
Yes.
aspects of the self or conscious awareness. So in that sense, you still have this triple layering
Yeah.
of reality. And then after that beyondness has been recognized in source awareness, if it precedes dynamic subjectivity, then that union takes place, then that sacred marriage takes place. And so the beyond is sort of forgotten about in a certain sense, which is interesting. And the fullness of the self is revealed, and then it's let go of into the void. So that's when it's, then
That's interesting, yeah, because I don't use the word void there for Brahman, because void implies a space, and space
it could,
is
yes,
a
yeah.
part of expression. Whereas the more common way of it's described in tradition, I mean, is as a no thing or a nothing.
Yeah, or nothingness. I like nothingness.
The empty, because like words like emptiness and void imply a space, which is
It could if you don't very clearly.
yeah, gotta be clear about definitions. Yeah.
Right. So I try to be as clear as possible about it.
Yes,
But yeah.
yes. There's also a progression that's worth mentioning in here. We talked a little bit about the cosmic body. There's actually a few precursors that can happen in the Upanishads talk about. The first one is the sense that I am the universe, and it's that my body is the universe. Now, in the larger context, that dynamic of consciousness being aware of itself creates a subtle space, not yet the space element, but a kind of a subtle space that I refer to as creation. And there's this initial play of consciousness playing out with itself. And then that kind of goes through several stages until it starts creating universes. So the first stage in that is the recognition that I am the universe. And it's essentially the experience, the universe is experienced as what's known as Hiranyagarbha, or the golden egg. Essentially, it's experienced like you're sitting inside this golden egg, and you and the egg are one, and your body is the one with that egg. And again, that's a very perceptual kind of experience. So that has to be going on.
Now that's different from feeling that you're the creator of the universe, right?
Yes.
So it's not like a Mahajiva recognition, but it's the universe itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's a layer that's kind of in between layer. There's what I refer to as the Davidya body, and it's kind of like a template of the human form that contains only Davidya on the level of points of light. So there's essentially it kind of doesn't make a lot of sense, but essentially it's a form, like an outline or whatever you want to call it, a template that's full of points of light that are interacting with themselves, and they're basically managing the bodies of all bodies in all time, in all universes simultaneously.
Yeah.
And it's because time, this is before space and time. So it's kind of a mind blower in that kind of sense. And then that is an expression of the cosmic body, which we talked about earlier, is the body of all bodies. So all those, bodies that the Devata are managing are kind of, there's a step back further. And I think you mentioned in your notes a body as nonlinear infinity.
Yes. Yeah. Nonlinear infinity. Exactly. So the body is, it's hard to, the mind cannot fathom nor imagine the body not having a defined linearity, because perceptually it seemed to be an outline of a certain region. But actually we can taste this, this actual experiential recognition where the body is infinite and it's pervasive, containing. There can be not only one universe recognized within it, but multiple universes. So it just depends on the degree of refinement. Now, there's also
what's refined, because there are, do we clarify on that? Because there are people who have very refined perception of, say, the emotional body or the geometry, the subtle geometry of behind form or whatever like that, but not so much deeper down.
Yeah.
where somebody else might have some very refined perception deeper down, but not so much there. Everybody has
Thank you.
different.
That's a great point, David. Like our friend Dorothy Rowe,
Yes,
she has much more clarity about lots of different levels that I don't have a lot of clarity about.
yes,
So I find it very beneficial to watch her material and tune in, because it kind of helps me to explore different areas that I really weren't a part of the exploration in the
yeah.
unfoldment here. It was more on a different level, as you mentioned in our last talk.
And
So,
you can get a sense too from what we're talking about how vast creation is, and so
mhm.
there's only so much time you have
All
to explore all these different things.
right.
So we tend to become specialists in a certain kind of way, where what we're most interested in, that's where we put our attention, and that's what unfolds in terms of refinement and what we're perceiving.
Yeah, and we're all going to bring out a different part of it's this, we all bring forward this unique recognition of reality within
Yeah.
itself, and a unique exploration of reality within itself.
And that's a key point, actually, and that's essentially why we're here. Each of
Mm,
us has a unique perspective of the whole, and consciousness knows itself globally, but it's kind of like at the cosmic level. This is one of the things that unfolds in this process, is we become aware of consciousness knowing itself globally and at every point.
mm,
And each one of those points can express forward as a being or an experiencer of some kind. And so each of those points is a specific perspective of that one whole. And it's a way to bring out all the detail, because
mm.
the consciousness knows itself globally, but by experiencing itself from every point, it brings out all the detail. And so that's what our role we have as an individual, a current individual, is to unfold the details of our perspective. Uh,
Mm.
so we all have a role. And in the broader perspective of the cycles of nature and creation and so on like that, it takes all of us to go through this process we're describing in some way, for the process to complete.
Beautiful.
Uh, and the fourth level after cosmic body is the I am the Veda. Um, Veda is a word that means knowledge, and essentially embedded in the divine mind is kind of the word I use for it. There's kind of this field at the top of creation, that's but slightly beyond creation, um, that has these um, templates, blueprints. Blueprint is sometimes what a word I use. And there's kind of the pattern for that particular. There's this series of different creations as well that are very different from ours, and each of them has their own kind of blueprint.
Hmm.
And then within that blueprint, there's also a kind of a schedule. It's kind of hard to describe exactly, but it's essentially there is a person who is going to be born, whose job it is to cognize a law of nature that's not currently expressed, which basically causes it to express, and it evolves creation to the next point.
Hmm.
That law of nature comes alive. Uh, it integrates with other laws of nature, and then the rules of the game change a little bit. And in the higher ages, there's more laws of nature that are functionally active, and that's a whole other topic. Um, Getting into the types of cognition and all this kind of thing.
Hmm.
But essentially, the there's this kind of process through, even though essentially it all happens at once. There's also again, to experience the detail, it's drawn out over apparent time. So there's a kind of a sequence of evolution and an unfolding. And so we come up and we have our experiences and add to the whole.
Yes. Yeah, beautiful. And so, and just going back to what you said about sort of that template or schedule, or however you want to contextualize it,
Yeah.
the capacity is to cognize it or to taste it in terms of its sort of simultaneity and its completion, and see it from that perspective. And then you can also sort of zoom out and see it in terms of its unfolding or its outstretching, in what appears to be our experience of sequence.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
So it's kind
and
of
that's
like there's
also relevant. with the unfoldment, the unfoldment of creation, and the thing that you were talking about before with the body, how all bodies are essentially this bifurcation of a basic blueprint for a body,
Yeah,
and so on and so forth.
exactly. Yeah, I ended up writing an article a bit ago on the 8 different ways you can experience time.
Mm.
Because it's not because it's essentially time is an effect of the process of experience.
Hmm.
Space is an effect of that consciousness becoming aware of itself, and that
Hmm.
that initial dynamic. It kind of creates this subtle space,
Hmm.
kind of a container, and then in that process of experience, and our relationship to that process of experience gives us an experience of time. So we
Hmm.
might experience, there's a past and a future in kind of the usual way, or we might experience everything is in the current now, where there's only the current in the present moment, or we
Hmm.
might experience all the past and the future are all in the present moment,
Hmm.
or there's time as eternal and so on.
Sure.
Time is not existing, unexpressed.
Yeah.
I can't remember now, but there's like 8 different ways that it can unfold, and it all relates to our perspective of process of experience. Um,
Yeah. And there can also be great flexibility with that too. So this sort of sense of being able to shift um, how that's being related to, so on and so forth, and in terms of our experience. And um, yeah, yeah.
yeah, and essentially what happens at a certain point. Now it kind of varies a little bit, but um, if there is an unfolding of refined unity, or that process, the feminine process, is continuing through the unity process, there comes to be some kind of point where essentially it knows itself fully,
Hmm.
where it knows itself globally, as I mentioned, and at every point within itself. There's that the experiential process. Again, this is a very intimate process. Everything we're talking about, we're not just experiencing it, we're recognizing it as ourselves,
Hmm.
because it's part of that unity process.
Yeah.
And it reaches a point where it kind of knows itself fully.
Mm.
And in the experience here, as I referenced earlier, there's a sense of like consciousness realizing it's been looking in on itself this whole time, and it kind of goes and turns and looks beyond itself.
Mhm.
So then there's a shift, the next shift uh, into Brahman. But if there's also a process um, of the referred to as God consciousness before, where there's an unfolding value of the personal God.
Mhm.
Um, this isn't necessarily experiencing forms of God, like um, the Vedic culture, and I kind of relate to that. There's a sense there's one divine,
Mhm.
but it takes many forms.
Yes.
Uh, Fundamental principles, essentially,
Mhm.
like love and power and so on, and they can be experienced as laws of nature, as
Mhm.
kind of an objective or masculine kind of way, sort of through the intellect, or through the heart um, as embodied with forms. And you kind of have your choice of how you want to experience that, depending on how the refinement is. So if there's that kind of process unfolding, then the climax of that in unity is recognizing that form of God is also the self, is also myself.
Is you
So there's
is
a merging, and this is where we get into one of those climactic stages of the refinement. The feminine process is the unification with our highest ideal, or the expressed God as myself. So it kind of climaxes that stage, and like in my case, for example, there was that, and then there was the recognition, essentially, that everything had become known within consciousness at that point, in the broader sense. And then the Brahman stage could unfold.
yeah.
Not
That's a
everybody has that kind of process going on. There has to be that kind of God consciousness process taking
Sure.
place.
And
Uh,
it's also has to do with the context, because I know, if you come from a more traditional setup like yourself, where you were exposed to the possibility of that, and sort of had scriptural backing, and then also um, had more of a traditional Vedic understanding of different laws of nature and those kinds of things, that's supportive of sort of a more modeled unfoldment taking place in that direction. You could say, not that it's always going to be like that,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it's
Well, that's
also
not the ideal, and there's lots of people I know that are following a general Vedic line who are
sure.
not necessarily unfolding those things. And I have
Yes,
no
yes,
idea
yes.
why I specifically, or where that's showing up here.
Hmm.
Um, Maybe because I'm supposed to talk about it or write about it and stuff, and so it's showing up so that I can help people with the process.
Yeah, no, that's really beautiful. I'm glad you made that point. And now I'm reflecting back on the way that it unfolded here. And in those terms, I encountered what I refer to as avataric bodies, which basically that just means like Krishnic body, Buddhic body, and a Christ body, which
Yeah,
is very similar to what you're talking about in merging with an ideal.
yeah,
So in terms of like Jesus, Shakyamuni Buddha, and Lord Bhagavan Sri Krishna, these were sort of primary pillars in the unfoldment here. They were present. And so at that point, what happened was that there was this total unification of their cosmic body, realizing that that was myself. So,
yes. And
and then
that's a
realize,
yeah, just to be clear though, because there's some differentiating to go on here. I mentioned earlier how there's kind of like the ideal. There's kind of like the form we most identify with, I guess you could say, our highest
yeah.
ideal, and that's kind of what is described in my tradition as the personal God.
Mhm.
And for some, that's the heart opening is quite closely associated with it. And then there's other forms of God that we can experience that we may not necessarily relate to that way. And in the unity process, we become one with those various forms.
Mm.
But the key with God realization is becoming one with the personal God. The
Beautiful.
Ishtadevata is referred to in the Sanskrit.
Okay. Yeah, and then there's some possibility for variation of in pure divinity with a lot of what we're talking about now in a different way.
Yeah,
Um,
so I find it a little bit uh, eye rolling when I hear some spiritual teachers say that they're Kalki or they're Krishna or something like that, um, because that's essentially an experience that's going to unfold for everybody at a certain point.
exactly.
It's not
And
nothing special there.
it's distinctly, even though it's a personality, it's distinctly impersonal. So unless there's some serious unresolved identification issues that are still present, it's not something that is taking you aback where you're like you're like standing there like, oh, I'm I'm Krishna or something. No, it's like I'm at the supermarket and my body is Krishna's body, and there's all of these world systems unfolding within this body, which is Krishna's body, and that is what I is. So
And yeah, and it's fascinating too, because there could be like I'm walking down the street or I'm in the supermarket or whatever like
yeah.
that. You kind of the physical body is doing something, and then there's kind of like the cosmic body, which
Hmm.
can be doing something different things
Sure.
simultaneously, and you are that also, and it's doing these things, and then there's some value of divine body or other body, other forms, which are also part of myself, and the attention can go there and see, oh, they're over in that part of the universe doing something, or
Hmm.
they're over here, but it's all the self, it's all myself.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's so important to recognize this has nothing, absolutely nothing to do with the glorification of an individual.
yeah,
It always is about the glorification of divinity. Divinity is the reality uh, that is. There's only divinity, and divinity is revealing itself to itself within its own mind.
yeah,
And any individual that we see as an embodiment of that, that's what we see in them. That is admirable. That's what we see in them that we desire or uh, hold as an ideal. It's the reflection of divinity as that embodiment, and it's not the particularity necessarily, although it is expressed in the particularity, but the value that pervades and shines as that particularized expression.
beautiful.
Yes.
Yeah, it's yeah, and it's so easy at any given point. I remember a friend of mine coming over one time. We got together, and he basically said, "I'm God and you're not," and he was kidding.
Nice.
He was kidding, but he was going through this process of experiencing himself as God, and he recognized the play was going on, but it was pretty funny. But
That is
I've
funny.
I've seen people actually invest in that a little more than they should, and
Sure.
that's when it gets to be a little tricky. You always have to keep all this stuff in proportion, because you're still a human going through this unfolding. There's still that latia vidya, or remains of ignorance, going on.
Yeah, and that's also where I, as you know, value the uh, devotion, the flow of devotion as well.
Yeah.
It comes in very handy in that context. So
And that really supports the surrender process to allow this
it
kind
does.
of thing to unfold as well, because you can get so, because each of these stages we're discussing, they feel real, and they can feel at a certain point complete. They
Hmm.
can feel like there's this fullness beyond anything we've ever experienced before, and this is amazing, and this has got to be the ultimate, and that kind of thing. And you can get invested in that, and that can become a bit of a barrier. But
Sure.
if you kind of just, then that's part of the reason why we talk about this kind of
Yeah.
stuff, that there's more,
Exactly.
partly to
And then you're
support
going to
people.
be,
Yeah, partly to support people for whom it's unfolding, but
yeah.
also to put it all in context, so you don't get too carried away with, oh yeah, God, I had this experience of God. That's pretty amazing, eh? I'm really
Yeah.
special. Yeah, well,
Right. And yeah, and that, it can be a lot of trickiness in terms of that being a barrier to certain levels of purification taking place as well. Because if there's this sort of false level of owning whatever recognition of reality is present, and something arises that seems to be conflictual with that, then the likelihood of you saying no to that or projecting it as being out there is increased greatly. Yeah.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, it's much less likely for people to unfold a God consciousness process after they wake up, if that's suppressed, and it's like, oh, that's just experiential, or that's, the heart's not relevant, or any of that kind of thing as part of their teaching.
yeah.
Yeah. And one other little detail to mention, I talk about the kosher model I mentioned earlier too. There's kind of these sense of sheaths where we have our physical body and our energy body and then mental body and so on, like that. In the self-realization through unity process, the dominant reality is that consciousness, and there's some variations on that, as you mentioned as well. But broadly speaking, consciousness is the dominant player in the unity and self-realization process. And it's when we step back beyond that, in however way that unfolds. I mean, I gave an example or two, but there's a gazillion ways you may subjectively experience this process.
Mm.
Um, but that's when you recognize that consciousness itself is also a sheath. It's also it has a, I mean, it's infinite and eternal in that kind of sense. But as mathematics does describe, that there is infinities within infinities, and
Yes.
spaces within spaces, and
Fields within fields, and that's
yeah,
the next in our next discussion. I do want to explore that sort of um, what I call the field contrast, or the field point contrast, and how that shows up and as things continue to unfold. And so,
great. Okay.
yeah. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to uh, sit back and watch how these conversations flow and unfold. And I think that this one has been is going to be a real treat for anyone that views it. And I've certainly enjoyed myself. So
Myself
thank
also.
you.
Thank you,
Thank you so
Richard.
much, David. And we just always give all glory to pure divinity. So.
Glory to creativity. Yes.